Hello, everybody out there. So, just uploaded another TE versus FE video using a scene from a movie to hopefully illustrate the point of people using TE versus FE. So, I invite you to go watch that. If you have any other recommendations, feel free to let me know if you know some good examples. So, I like doing those things. Okay, so this is live. If you're out there, feel free to jump in the chat and say hey. Um, and I wanted to just sort of riff on um, some ground rules. Let's set some ground rules here. So, before every baseball game, the managers have to go talk to the umps and they have to put together the ground rules, because every field is different. So they have to figure out, what's going to be you know, out of bounds and all that kind of stuff, depending on the different ballparks. And so let's set some ground rules for interacting in the typology community, especially the cognitive function community. And I'm going to be a little pedantic here, um, such as I am, and go through sort of the history of personality types and whatnot. And I think it sort of will help explain some of the friction, or yeah, some of the friction out there of sort of arguing about type, because if you're going to argue about type, you should at least sort of follow, again, some ground rules here. Because otherwise it's just sort of arguing past each other. And this is somewhat motivated. I mean, this has always been an issue in the back of my mind or the front of my mind. But it's sort of recently rekindled, because there's a typing session over on Eric's channel, talking with famous people. And, he came to the conclusion in the video that somebody was a such and such, a certain sort of type. And as usual, people are able to express their opinion of, in the comments of whether or not they agree with that. And that's all well and good. That's all part of the fun. But the issue is that typically, or more often than not, let's just say, when somebody sort of swoops in and wants to argue that this person is not that type, they're this other type, and here's why. They rely on descriptions, the sort of the type descriptions, the adjectives to describe somebody of a particular type. And in this particular case, I think they were saying something like, they can't be such and such type because that type doesn't really express themselves, emotionally very well, and this person does express themselves, and that's sort of up to debate, but let's just say it's true. So that's looking at an adjective, right? That somebody is emotive. You would describe them as being emotive, um, as opposed to a verb. And when you're talking about cognitive functions, we're talking about verbs, not adjectives. We're talking about what people are doing or people's minds are doing in real time. Which function are they using and to what extent is it effortless, right? The more effortless it is, the higher it probably is in your cognitive stack, right? And we can argue back and forth about how effortless somebody is or is not on a particular task. I get that. But we have this way, or this sort of linchpin model, where we can at least pinpoint the polar function where it's sort of it's a difference in kind as opposed to degree, where the person just sort of falls off a cliff, right? Um, in terms of effort when they have to engage in the function. Um, and there's a lot of different explanations of why that might be. They're trying to use their tool function to solve the problem because they're in a domain space where they typically use or problem solving domain, computational domain, right? They're either trying to deliberate or they're trying to extract knowledge from a knowledge base, or they're trying to interface with the outside world, or they are trying to deliberation, knowledge, interface, or they're trying to engage in some sort of action, whether it's verbal, metaphysical, or physical world action. Um, and they're in that domain, and they want to use their tool function, but the skills test is, when they're being typed, is trying to get them to use the other function. So they want to use introverted feeling because it's a deliberation question, but the skills test is trying to get them to use introverted thinking, right? And it's that conflict between the two functions that are in the same problem solving domain space that causes this polar function to sort of manifest itself, right? That's all computational based. It has very little to do with adjectives or description. I mean, other than just saying whether it appears to be effortless or not, there's really no other adjectives. It's all about verb. It's, the extent to which they can or cannot do it. And the level of effort it takes, because this is all about attention and how much attention do you have to spend when engaging in this function. So if you take a step back and you just view the person and their behavior as they're engaging in whatever function, trying to describe them using adjectives doesn't do the trick, right? You can't say they're bubbly or emotive or creative or industrious or reserved or precise or whatever. I mean, yeah, that goes hand in hand with a lot of functions, but not necessarily all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean if somebody is quiet and reserved that they are a thinker as opposed to a feeler. I mean, go watch my Godfather video that I just posted. Vito Corleone is very, very quiet, very, very reserved, very sort of deferential. Um, and you could describe that as being introverted in thinking, right? A lot of people might think of it that way, but from a behavior descriptive trait based view of it. But he's clearly engaging in extroverted feeling. He's controlling the social dynamics on multiple levels: the here and now, the future, long term planning, short term planning, different relationships among different people. He's all over the place, but it's effortless for him, and he's very quiet. He's very reserved. He's not acting like an extrovert, right? But he's clearly using extroverted feeling. And he's not being bubbly and gregarious, the types of adjectives that we typically associate with extroverted feeling. If you just described him on from that scene on an adjective level, if I just said, hey, just give me 15 adjectives that describe Vito Corleone in this particular scene: quiet, reserved, contemplative, deferential, polite, blah, 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 blah. I could go on. Somebody who just reads that list of words might come out of that and say, "Oh, that's a thinker," right? Because he looks like a thinker in that scene, but that's not what he's doing, right? That's not the verb that describes what he's doing. And if I conversely asked you, okay, describe what he's the cognitive process that he's using, or the goal that he's trying to achieve mentally, you would hopefully, if you understand the scene, you would describe that, he's trying to control the social dynamics and his relationships, and he's also trying to be polite, and not rock the boat, but also, be very clear with his intentions, and blah 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 blah. And then I would come from that reading it as, oh, he looks like he's engaging in extroverted feeling, because that's what he is doing, right? So the point being that if you just try to describe him, is he being emotive? Is he being bubbly? Is he being high energy? That doesn't sound like extroverted feeling, right? In the way that we just sort of colloquially know extroverted feeling to be, right? He's not up there acting like a cheerleader. But he's clearly engaging in extroverted feeling, because if you look at what he's doing, from a process point, okay? So this all stems from the fact that there are different approaches to personality out there, like quote unquote measuring personality or describing personality. And so it's very easy to fall into the adjective trap. And I don't even really want to call it a trap, because there are, the Oceans model is trait based, it's adjective based. And I'll go into that in a second. And it's perfectly fine, from a validity and reliability sort of, is this describing a real world phenomenon perspective. It's got its limitations on how much you might be able to apply it and other things, but but I'm not trying to say that it's worthless and and wrong. But it's adjective based, it's trait based. And so let me just sort of explain sort of the way they came up with the Oceans model and early personality research. And you have to keep in mind when this is all occurring. This is all occurring around World War One, World War Two, where the psychologists out there were all trying to figure out, how can we get the best soldiers, right? A very nationalistic time in history where everybody was flexing their military muscles. And you had people, throughout Europe. Spearman is the big example, where he was trying to figure out general intelligence, and he was also trying to figure out personality, using all these fancy statistical methods that we still use today. Spearman correlation, Spearman's G, all that kind of stuff. Spearman's row, I think. You'll have to check me on that. But anyways, he came up with all these statistical methods to figure out, okay, how can we categorize people, from sort of best to worst, as far as best soldiers, people who sort of are the best soldiers to people who would be like the worst soldiers, that kind of thing. Or people who are the best at working in the factory to people who are probably going to be the worst at working in the factory, that kind of stuff. But the way that they did it early on is they went and just asked people, okay, describe so and so in as many adjectives as you can. Just write down as many words that you can to describe this particular person. And they did that with hundreds and hundreds of people that were all being described. And then they looked at all the words and found that, typical words used to describe one person tended to correlate, right? So if somebody was extroverted, let's say, or then people would use words like, gregarious or wordy or loud or boisterous, or just words that might describe somebody who's being extroverted, friendly, that kind of stuff, approachable, whatever. And they started to lump all these words together to find out that, okay, if somebody uses the word approachable and bubbly, there's a correlation between those two words. They tend to show up together, in sort of these lumps, right? And then they did all this fancy statistical stuff like factor analysis and correlations and all that to find out that basically, if you take all of the words that describe people in their traits, and their personalities, so to speak, the words sort of fall into five different categories, which they eventually termed, conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion, right? And so somebody who's high on extroversion, they tend to have a bunch of words that are strongly correlated with each other used to describe them, but those words are not used to describe somebody who's high in, um, conscientiousness, let's say, right? So they have a correlation with these particular words have a correlation with this trait. They don't have a correlation with this trait, but there's another set of words that has a correlation with conscientiousness that doesn't have a correlation with all the other traits, right? So they're able to sort of parse things out over time and figure out, okay, is somebody high in conscientiousness, agreeableness, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Point being, again, that they were using adjectives. They were using ways to describe people, words that we would use adjectives to describe people: bubbly, creative, reserved, outward, extroverted, approachable, non-approachable, grumpy, all those the hundreds and hundreds of adjectives you could think of. They all sort of fall into one of those five categories. So the model says, okay? So there's this tendency when we talk about personality to think of it that way. Is this person approachable? Is this person reserved? Is this person quiet? Are they um are they particular? Are they precise? Those are words that might correlate well with conscientiousness. Okay. So when it comes, and the other reason that the oceans model is so popular in academia is it's a continuous variable. And in statistics, you have variables that are continuous and variables that are discrete. So a continuous variable would be something like height, right? You could be 5 feet, 5 feet four, 5 feet four and a half, 5 feet four and a half and three quarter, like it's a continuous variable, height or distance or whatever can be measured continuously, as opposed to discrete variables like were you born in August or September or November or January. Those are all discrete variables because you're in one category, and the categories don't necessarily blend together. It's not on a spectrum. Okay. In most statistical models that have to do with correlation and stuff like that, you need continuous variables. If you start throwing discrete variables in there, it sort of screws things up and it's not as kind of reliable. So people like the oceans model because they're you're either high on conscientiousness or you're somewhere on the gradient, right? You're low on it or you're high on it. And that's a continuous variable based off of the inventory that they give you. They will put you somewhere on that spectrum. Okay. Now, whether or not they're doing a good job of it, that's another story, but that comes down to validity and reliability, and let's just assume it has it. Okay. And so then they can correlate, conscientiousness with things like socioeconomic status. Again, another continuous variable because we're talking about how much money you make, and that's arguably continuous. Or you could do height, are tall people more conscientious than short people, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of, fancy things that they do. Um, you know, Criminality, all that kind of stuff. Um, you compare that to something like typology, MBTI, where you have an INFJ and ESTJ, that those are all discrete variables, right? And so you can't really run the same sort of correlations. And that's why MBTI doesn't really work in academia all that much. That and they sort of protect their IP. And yeah, they'll say you can, score high on extroversion, you're like a 55% extroversion, compared to introversion, you're 45%. But that's not really the same thing as a continuous variable, because once you flip into, being extroverted, you're extroverted, right? It doesn't matter if it's a lot of extroversion or a little bit of extroversion, you're extroverted. Or once you flip into being intuitive, you're not a sensor. And I know some people like to argue, I'm half extroverted, half introverted. That's just because they just don't understand how this all works. Or I'm half intuitive, half sensor, right? And those of you who have been playing along long enough understand how that just doesn't work when you're trying to come up with which type somebody is, which category do they fall in, right? Because an ESFJ is very different than an ENFJ, and we all know that. And it's not a matter of just a small difference on the spectrum, right? Okay. So where am I going with this? Okay. So first of all, because of its history, because of the oceans model and the Spearman correlations and all that, and early, you know, um, personality testing, there's this tendency to look at personality on an adjective trait based phenomenon. Somebody is extroverted in the colloquial sense, right? Somebody's approachable, somebody's creative, somebody's reserved, somebody's particular, somebody is um, aggressive, somebody's, I don't know, dominant, whatever, right? Just pick any adjective you want that describes somebody. There's thousands of them, right? And then we tend to associate those traits, those adjectives, with the personality types, the MBTI type. Let's just say MBTI for lack of a better, or just you know, just for shorthand. And we try to say INFJs are reserved, and INFJs are creative, and INFJs are independent, and all this kind of stuff. And then it leads to sort of affirming the consequent, right? The fallacy of affirming the consequent. I think I'm using the right terminology. Eric, correct me if I'm wrong. Where we'll say, oh, well, INFJs are reserved, and this guy doesn't seem very reserved. He seems actually pretty, bubbly. Or ESFJs are bubbly and emotive and full of energy, and this guy is very reserved and calculating and calm and sort of demure and laid back. He can't be an ESFJ because that's not how we describe ESFJs, right? But again, it's not about describing, it's not about adjectives, it's about verbs. And it is what cognitive functions are they using and how much effort does it take them to use it, right? If it's a dominant function or secondary function, it's going to take very little effort. And again, I would invite you to go look at the Zendaya video that I posted, the second one, where Zendaya is answering a bunch of these Vanity Fair questions about herself, and they're all these FI questions. And she starts just having a really hard time at it. It's taking a lot of effort. Even when she started, it took a lot of effort for her to answer him. I mean, could she answer him? Yeah, somewhat. I mean, but it got to the point where she just couldn't give an answer. She was just like, I've had enough of this. So clearly took a lot of effort, right, for her to engage in FI. And I would argue it was to the point where it was like polar for her. And then you compare her to the other people who have done the exact same questions, like Dan Levy, Spike Lee, a couple of other people, and they do it effortlessly. They don't even have to think about it, right? The person asks the question, and they have a response like almost immediately, right? And they're very high in FI. Okay. Now, I would describe the only adjective that I would use to differentiate Zendaya and these guys is effortless. Was it effortless, or was the person getting frustrated? That's it. That's really the only adjective that you need. Um, there are other ways to sort of describe the phenomenon where if somebody's TE polar, they just fall off a cliff and just don't even really answer the question being asked, right? But again, that's not an adjective. That's just describing what they're doing. That's describing the verb, not the adjective. Okay. So really, I guess the point here is if the only real adjectives that should enter into the equation, at least when you're trying to nail down a type and start an argument about whether somebody's a particular type or not, or a deliberation, let's say, maybe not an argument. The only adjectives that should enter in is effort or frustrated, right? Are they doing it effortlessly? Are they acting frustrated? Okay. Other than that, it's purely just, what are they doing? And the other way to look at it is if it's an FI question, are they answering it in a TI way? Are they trying to make an FI question which is a subjective deliberation, into a objective deliberation, right? Like with Zendaya, she kept trying to get the person who's interviewing her to affirm her answer, right? As if there was like an objective correct answer, right? So, who's your favorite author? I don't know, John Steinbeck. Is John Steinbeck a good answer? Somebody with FI, they don't care whether you think that's a good answer or not, because they're looking at it from a subjective standpoint. Who do I personally think subjectively is a good author? John Steinbeck. No problem. That's a Dan Levy answer. Somebody with strong TI and very polar FI, it's gonna be like, John Steinbeck. Is that he's good, right? Because again, they're making this subjective question into an objective question. Is this am I giving you a correct answer? And this is probably another video for another day, but that's a very telling way of figuring out if somebody is an FI user or a TI user front stack, is if they look at things from a subjective point of view versus an objective point of view. Okay. And yeah, I get it. I'm sort of describing what they're doing, what they're doing, but I'm describing what they're doing. I'm not describing the way they're acting, right? Other than frustrated versus effortless. So, and again, maybe go back and watch. Well, I also put up a video from The Last of Us. TE, where the guy was a TE user as opposed to an FE user. And again, he, when he's engaged in his TE part, it's very effortless. He just sort of rambles on about this gadget that he's fixing and how you got to do this and then do that. And he's got zero problem, right? Describing this gadget. Then as soon as she starts asking him questions about his relationship with this other character, he starts getting frustrated and giving these weird, sort of convoluted half answers. And it was a real good example of writing that shows the juxtaposition of when he's comfortable versus when he's not comfortable. He's comfortable in TE world, not comfortable in FE world, and it made his discomfort in FE world that much more obvious, right? Because it's sort of a foil. It's, you're in your mind, you're comparing how effortlessly he did the TE stuff and then how much effort and frustration it took to do the FE stuff. And it makes it even that, like his FE problem even that more obvious, right? Or, noticeable. Okay, so really good writing on their part. And then you compare that to The Godfather, right? Where, Corleone, all he's doing is FE stuff. He's not getting into TE at all. And I would argue he probably isn't TE polar anyways, so it probably wouldn't have frustrated him all that much, even if he had to do TE stuff. But point is, the FE stuff, he was very effortless. And the way that you would describe those two characters, one doing TE stuff and one doing FE stuff, might be very similar. Quiet, reserved, laid back, whatever, right? You might describe those two people with the same types of adjectives, but they're doing different functions, right? One's doing TE, one's doing FE. So describing people in the way that they come across uh, is not going to do the trick. And I get it that, at some point you're going to, as you sort of discuss this stuff, you're naturally going to fall into describing behaviors, things like that. It's almost inevitable and unavoidable. So I get that, you can't be a complete purist, right, on this kind of stuff. But at least when you're starting off, you want to keep in mind, number one, if you're going to make an argument about what type somebody is, the first thing you have to say, the first hurdle you have to clear is that to show why you think they're polar in whatever function they should be polar in, given the type you're arguing, right? So if I'm trying to argue that somebody is an INFJ, the very first thing I have to argue, or the first case claim I have to make or hurdle I have to cross, is to show that they are somehow TE polar. They're somehow exhibiting TE polar behavior. And if I can't point to something where they're exhibiting TE polar behavior, then everything else is just guessing, right? Because everybody can do all the other functions, to some degree, right? But you have to start with the polar function. You can't just say INFJs are very reserved and this person's just not reserved. So therefore they're not an INFJ. Or INFJs are very independent and this person's just not very independent. So they can't be an INFJ. And this person is very bubbly and ENFJs are bubbly. So they're probably an ENFJ, right? But you're not making any claim about what their polar function is. You're not making any claim about what they're doing on a cognitive function basis. You're just, relying on these trait descriptions. Okay. Using adjectives, not verbs, is the point. Okay. I think I've beaten this horse to death. So I'd be interested in hearing any comments. And we'll take it from there. All right. See you next time. Bye.